Hi there. I made a couple of videos about creation of man, creation in general, and the fall of man, and I just wanted to add a couple of things that I think may be important. And my source of inspiration for all of this is the great Canadian theologian and New Testament scholar Don Carson. So look him up on the internet, look him up on YouTube, because I've combined several of his lectures and I've added something of my own to all of it so that it becomes indistinguishable. You can't tell where he ends and I start, but that's not a problem. That's how we can do this. Okay, without further ado, let's start with our lecture here. So we're going to make some remarks on man's creation and the fall. Well, first of all, the story of creation is emphatically in opposition to the idea of a closed universe, naturalism. That's the philosophy behind the modern sciences. Um, every effect that everything that you can see is an effect of a cause, and that cause is also part of the universe. So ultimately, the beginning of the universe must be some kind of a cause that um, created itself. Causa sui in Latin, something that caused itself. In one way or another, that is the origin of the universe. But it's also in opposition to the idea of an open universe, just like you have in this weird sort of primitive religion called animism, that everything can be a vehicle of something divine. Creation is open to all sorts of influences from beyond creation. Creation in the Bible does not admit to that kind of a view. The idea that God is both creator, that is to say that he is the origin and the designer of creation, and that he is also the sustainer of the world. Without his continuous will to keep the cosmos in existence, the universe would simply evaporate. But it means that the universe is seen as ordered and controlled. He's designer, so there is an order in creation. And he's the origin and sustainer, so he has the power, he is the power that keeps the universe going. Now, just as a side remark, I'm going to repeat what I said in some other lectures last week. The Bible describes the world phenomenologically from human experience and language. So that's important. It's like saying the sun comes up in the east, which is not really true in a scientific sense, because the earth is spinning round its axis, and that is why it seems to us that the sun is coming above the horizon in the east. Nevertheless, as a phenomenological statement, it's quite correct. Within our language, within our experience, that is exactly the way we should experience it. And it's correct to say it like that. Now, the universe is created. God is not created. There is this ultimate and absolute difference between the creator and his creation. We can deduce a couple of things from that. First of all, the existence of the universe is not necessary. That's something that has to be. And that is why in creation, in nature, we see all these things which do not have to be. They're the outcome of a history. They are the outcome maybe of accidents, but they are not necessary. The cosmos is not a system of portraying the necessary outcome of necessary causes. The existence of the universe is not an inevitable divine emanation. If you take a look at the biblical account of the relationship between God and creation, God didn't simply by his own nature bring about the existence of the cosmos. It's not necessary for him to be the source and the origin and the the sustainer of the universe. And thirdly, the existence of the universe is not the result of an arbitrary activity by God. It's not just something that came up in his mind and he did it as a side effect of his being. No, it's something that God really intended to make happen. He intended creation to exist. Well, if you put all of this together, if something is not necessary, if it's not simply the product of the nature of something, if it's not an arbitrary activity that is the cause of creation, then we must say creation is the beginning of a story. A story doesn't explain to us necessities or inevitabilities or not even the arbitrary acts of something. It portrays the voluntary, intentional acts of the subjects in the story. It evolves historically. It has uh, moments in it that are, let's say, non-necessary. They're simply events that happen. So the beginning of creation, according to the Bible, is the beginning of a story. Something is going to happen. Actually, it is the beginning of history. Secondly, the idea that the universe is created as a whole, so everything and every human being is the intentional product of God's creative activity, it also grounds the idea that God is ultimately the God of all, which is a very important statement. It excludes all kinds of racism. Furthermore, material reality is created by God and therefore, on that ground alone, is good. There is no dualism between the spiritual and the material. The story of the Bible is therefore at least an anticipation of the restoration of goodness, because in our experience, the world, nature, the cosmos is not good. But the story of creation tells us that it was intended to be good by a good creator. Therefore, immediately at the beginning of the story of creation, we know that the story that is about to develop is the story of the restoration of goodness. It's therefore about the new heaven and the new earth that the book of Revelation talks about immediately after Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2, the two chapters at the beginning, have no reference to sin, but Genesis 3, of course, is the story of the fall. Then, my fourth point, creation has an order within itself and it has certain structures. So, the explanation, for instance, of the relationship between man and woman, or the relationship between man and the whole of creation, he is supposed to take care of that creation. Man's creation is elaborated as the completion of creation as a whole. So ultimately, man is at the pinnacle of creation. He is, let's say, the point where creation points to. And furthermore, I think beyond that, the ultimate point of reference for creation is the Sabbath, because on the Sabbath there is this communion between God and man. So I think the Sabbath, actually the seventh day, is the real completion of creation. Creation is the given totality of an order, a natural order, that is the presupposition of our historical existence. So our existence in time, our lives, they have this presupposition of creation. You cannot have a good understanding of your own life if your presuppositions are mixed or are wrong. If the presupposition is that you came about in a closed universe or in an open universe, by necessity or by an emanation, you will misunderstand the historic nature of your own existence. This created order cannot be changed within history. Man is unable to say, okay, let's change it. Let's dispense with the difference between men and women. Let's dispense with the necessities of the social order. We cannot change that. Everything that God provided in Genesis 1 to 11, and even what he provided in the whole of the Torah, cannot be changed. It's impossible. It's a created order that is there for infinity. God will ultimately continue the order of creation and the history of creation. So all the things that are there in the order of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and all the texts in the Bible that support Genesis 1 and 2, will ultimately be there throughout history. God Himself will actually, will actively sustain the order that He wanted to put into creation. And it's a good idea for us to take note of that. We go to the second point, the creation of man in the image and after the likeness of God. 6 consequences. And I'm completely relying here on Don Carson, who made a wonderful statement about this. Man is meant to be a person, and therefore his creator is also a person. So, a consequence of this idea that man is created in the image and after the likeness of God is the personal nature of our existence, of God's existence. And because if we are personal creatures and we are created in the image of God, then God, as the, let's say, the original, is supposed to have personal existence. We talked about these two terms, Tselem and Demut, likeness and image. I said image has to do with position, and likeness has to do with character. So that's very important to note. We are meant to be a person that stands toward creation in the same kind of relationship that God has. So we are in that sense like Elohim. And we have the character of God necessary to take care of creation. And that's the idea of B'Tselmenu, that we are after the likeness of God. Now, we should understand that that gives man an awesome dignity. If we understand man to be a product of evolution, there's no such thing as an awesome dignity. To be this separate being that God intended to be like a partner on earth, that He gave these character traits, that He shared His personality with. That's an awesome dignity. You can't find that in any kind of evolutionary or biological understanding of man. Also, man has both a high privilege and a high moral responsibility. Because if you are at the pinnacle of creation, then you have the ability to understand other people, to stand in relationships with other people. Your job is to reflect the goodness of the Creator. After all, that is the position that you have. It's a position of responsibility, high moral responsibility, and a high privilege, because you are actually ruling creation. You are, let's say, the creature, the creature that is put in the position of taking care of creation, which demands that you have sovereignty. It also means that man has a profound ability to know God intimately, created in His image. So, by looking at ourselves, we can discern something of the character of God. It also explains our desire to be creative in the arts, in science, and technology. So, it also explains our desire to be just as God. I'm not sure that I want to keep this part of it. Let's get rid of it. I don't think it's very useful to phrase it like that. Man has the capacity to enter into personal relationships. Obviously, he is created Zachar u'Nekeva, male and female. They are in a relationship. That is how God meant human beings to be, and that explains also why man is created in the image of God, because God is all about relationships. Selfishness is the opposite of the dignity conferred on man. So, selfishness is something that we need to deal with, need to get rid of. Now, in our modern age, the loss of self identity, not being able to accept who you are or not being accepted as the person that you are, will always result in the sense of meaninglessness. If I lose myself, Well, what have I left? Uh, it might even turn into despair, total despair about the meaning of life. That has to do with the loss of self identity. However, um, in the attempt to um, get rid of or to evade this loss of self identity, in our culture, we insist on the expression of oneself. I want to be whoever I am. I want to do whatever I want to do. I want everyone else to clear the path for me. It will eventually lead to chaos. On the other hand, self denial and voluntary submission to the ways of God, they will establish purpose and fulfillment of life. That is something that we can learn from creation. To submit to God is the way that a human being can be himself. But take away this ability to submit to God, you get alienation between man and the soil, alienation between man and his wife, alienation between the two brothers, Cain and Abel, alienation between the line of Seth and the line of um, uh, Cain. You get all these divergencies in the history of humanity, all coming from this desire to express myself as an independent and autonomous being. Okay. Thirdly, the fact that humans are responsible to God is the premise of the entire biblical narrative. We are supposed to um, respond to God's divine will. We are responsible beings. It makes also clear that our actions carry ultimate meaning. That's something of great importance. Even what no one can see, even the thoughts in my mind, even the actions that are committed in the dark, they are of consequence. The relationship with the Creator implies that they are of consequence. Our identity is therefore also of paramount importance. Who are we? We are standing before God as what kind of creatures? Rebellious, in denial, atheists, or are we submitting to this God in a humble frame of mind? Now, of course, this is at odds with modern culture. Neoliberalism says that human beings dispose of their own righteousness. We are the guardians of our own righteousness. We determine what is right and wrong. We are not actually accountable. Either there are natural causes for me to commit a crime, or my crime is actually an action out of my self interest, which should be acceptable. And nothing is anyone's fault. And so things happen. It just happens, and we have a collision in the street, and nobody is at fault. There's no responsibility anymore. Therefore, in today's culture, people look for a scapegoat rather than a savior. So, who can we blame? Two people collide in their cars. Maybe the car maker is to blame. Maybe we can sue the car maker. And because everyone feels like a victim, they have no idea what this means. Because everyone feels like a victim, they only ask for a therapist or a lawyer. These are the two main forms of quasi religion. A therapist gets you back into um, the normality of life, gets you back on track to pursue your own goals, and a lawyer will do the same, but simply by attacking others that stand in your way, or attacking someone who has actually hurt you. But we are victims in both cases, a victim of psychological processes. Then we go to the therapist, victims of an unjust action by someone else. Then we go to the lawyer. But we are all victims in the first place. Because God is our creator, we're not victims, but we are accountable. After all, we were made by God in order to exist for Him. So the goal of life, let's say the meaning of life, is actually ingrained into our existence. We are created by God in order to exist before Him. Fourthly, because man is created in the image and likeness of God, we are all restless when we suppress this truth. Restless is our heart until we discover who God is, because He is the origin and the sustainer of our life. The fact of creation makes true knowledge of the living God possible. If creation is something that happens outside of God, is no longer connected to God, then the knowledge of the living God doesn't mean a thing. If it's not connected to the source of my existence, then the knowledge of God is without any meaning. Spiritual communion with God is the purpose of our creation. We found that in Genesis 1 and 2. So, the fifth, the fact that human beings are created in the image of God means that our so-called nature cannot be taken as neutral. And there are people now who, especially when it comes to gender issues, think that, let's say, the difference between male and female is actually a social construct that is not really based on real biological differences. That would imply that our nature is neutral and malleable, that we can do with it as we please, and that our social constructs take precedence over natural ideas. However, that is not the case. There is no neutrality in nature. Nature does indeed prescribe, at least for the majority of people, what they are. The biological distinctions are important. The gender difference is actually really important. Human nature must be seen in the perspective of our responsibility. So it's not about constructing my natural identity, but it's about dealing responsibly with my natural identity. And let's apply it to one other field. Our ecological problems are ultimately due to the consequences of the fall. So it's also true in our relationship, not just between genders, but also between ourselves as technological, inventive, and innovative and creative beings with nature, with our natural environment. So the consequences of the fall are also present in our ecological problems. This hubris, this arrogance of man, he's supposed to take care of his creation, but instead he selfishly exploits nature for himself. And when he does that, ultimately he also creates problems for himself. Okay. 6. Adam, created in the image of God, anticipates the new Adam made in the image of the invisible God. You find that in Colossians 2, the verse where this is said about Christ. The new Adam, that is Christ, is the model of redeemed humanity. Okay, finally, some remarks about the fall. The fall can be correctly understood only if we see it in the light of the entire Bible, so not just Genesis 3. And then we need to take a look at the whole Bible and to see where God is trying to reverse the effects of the fall, the introduction of sin into the world. Well, the flood is the end of the first attempt at redemption. Didn't work. And Noah's drunkenness and the parallel between the new beginning with Noah and the history of paradise, there is a whole series of parallels and similarities between the two stories. It makes clear that by using the flood as a means for punishment, let's say, use your imagination. What if God punished the whole of humanity by drowning them in the flood? Well, even so, the new beginning would still be fallible. It would not contain the ultimate solution. So people who say, why doesn't God make an end to all sin in the world? Well, he could have done that with the flood, and if he had done it with the flood, ultimately sin would return in the history of human beings. The calling of Abraham, so the beginning of the nation of Israel, and then the calling of Israel also ultimately failed. They failed with regard to the definitive solution to the problem of sin. They failed with regard to bringing the ultimate paradise. Certainly, the history of Israel didn't succeed in doing that, which doesn't mean that the history of Israel is without importance for the gospel. Kingship, the first one Saul, and then David, and exile, first the northern kingdom, Israel, and then the southern kingdom, Judah, went into respectively the Assyrian and the Babylonian exile. They also formed an indication of the failure of that particular form of redemption. Uh, the selection of this particular people, and then uh, giving them the Torah, and then seeing them act in idolatry, meant that ultimately that redemption, that redemptive attempt by God, failed. Then the restoration of the temple in the city of Jerusalem under Ezra and Nehemiah, who returned from the Babylonian captivity with maybe 10,000, 15,000 people ultimately, was only an anticipation and remained incomplete. So even the return to the Holy Land without a king, with a high priest, the high priest was given by the Zadokites or the Sadducees, and the Pharisees and the Essenes, all these groups of people that lived in the era of Jesus Christ. The return to the land of Israel was an anticipation. It merely prefigured what was supposed to happen ultimately. The final redemption was given with the coming of the Messiah, when all peoples would accept the priority of Israel, all nations would accept the Torah, the Messiah would rule from Jerusalem over the whole earth, where violence would be totally driven out. This wonderful messianic kingdom, we are still waiting for that. And of course, in a Christian perspective, we argue that the Messiah was defeated in history, first of all, that he went to the cross to make a point, and that here the Mashiach ben Yosef, the Messiah, the son of Joseph, died on the cross, and that death on the cross had redemptive effects, redemptive, let's say, qualities. But he triumphs over that history in the shape of the resurrection. So we confess Jesus to be alive, making redemption possible in the future. So with Israel, we are still waiting for the ultimate redemption in the future. Okay, that is my addition to the videos that I already made, some remarks on the creation of man and the fall. Thank you very much for your interest in all of this, and hope to see you soon.